Amara, tell me I'm imagining this.
You divorced me because you believed I could never give you children.
Then why do they have my face?
Because 5 years ago, someone made sure you never knew they existed.
Her tiny hand shot up in the middle of a 500-person gala, pointed straight at Seoul's coldest billionaire, and asked the one question his money could never answer. "Are you my daddy?" The silence that followed was louder than anything Kang Tae-hyun had heard in 5 years of running an empire. The Grand Hyatt ballroom smelled like white lilies and old money, the kind of scent that costs more per bouquet than most people's rent. Kang Tae-hyun stood near the champagne fountain doing what he did best, looking bored while secretly calculating the net worth of everyone in the room. It was a hobby, a joyless one, like most of his hobbies since the divorce. "You've been staring at that fountain for 10 minutes, his assistant Ji-ho muttered beside him. "Should I be worried you're planning to buy it?" "I'm considering it," Tae-hyun said flatly. "It has better conversation than most people here." That was the thing about Tae-hyun's humor. It existed technically, the way a glacier technically moves. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, and only noticeable if you were patient enough or foolish enough to wait around for it. He hadn't always been this way. Once there had been a woman who could pull warmth out of him like she was defrosting a freezer with nothing but sarcasm and a smile. But that woman had left 5 years ago with one suitcase, one photograph, and a diagnosis that made his family sigh in relief the way people sigh when a stock finally crashes back down to a manageable loss. He didn't think about her anymore. He told himself that so often it had almost become believable, the same way a man tells himself the check is in the mail. Then the doors opened. Tae-hyun didn't notice at first. He was busy pretending to read a text so he wouldn't have to make small talk with his aunt's newest candidate for future Mrs. Kang, a woman whose personality seemed to consist entirely of expensive perfume and aggressive eye contact. But the room noticed. The room went quiet in that specific electric way rooms go quiet when something extraordinary walks in wearing 4 matching coats. Amara Williams stood in the doorway like she owned the building, the block, and possibly the city's water rights. 5 years hadn't softened her. If anything, she looked sharper, the kind of beautiful that came from surviving things rather than being sheltered from them. Beside her, holding her hands with the fierce grip of children who'd learned early that hands could be trusted more than promises, stood 4 small figures. 2 boys, 2 girls, all around 4 years old, all wearing the unmistakable Kang jawline like a genetic receipt nobody had asked for. Tae-hyun's phone slipped from his hand and hit the marble floor. He didn't notice that either. "Sir," Ji-ho said carefully, "did you know Mrs. Williams had—" "I don't know what I know right now," Tae-hyun said, which was, for a man who prided himself on always knowing exactly what he knew, possibly the most honest sentence he'd spoken in 5 years. He watched, frozen, as Amara guided the children through the crowd with the calm precision of a woman who had clearly done this, walked into rooms full of people who underestimated her, many, many times before. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Every eye in the ballroom had already made the introduction for her. It was the smallest of the 4, a girl with her mother's stubborn chin and her father's unfortunate inability to hide his feelings, who broke away first. She marched toward Tae-hyun like she'd been rehearsing this moment her entire short life, stopped directly in front of him, tilted her head, and asked the question that would end his carefully constructed universe. "Are you my daddy?" Somewhere behind him, his aunt's champagne glass made a small, satisfying crack against the floor. The sound, Tae-hyun would later think, of an entire cover-up beginning to collapse. He crouched down slowly, the way you'd approach something you were terrified of frightening away. Up close, she had his mother's eyes. His mother, who had died believing her only son was incapable of giving her grandchildren, because that was the story she'd been told, the story everyone had been told, the story Tae-hyun himself had authorized with the signature he barely remembered giving. "What's your name?" he asked, because it was the only question his brain could produce. "Arya," she said, proud of herself, like she'd passed a test. "That's my brother Kai. Those are my sisters Noah and Lena." 4 names, 4 heartbeats he'd never known existed. 4 children who'd grown up on another continent while he'd sat in glass offices, convincing himself that losing Amara had been the responsible decision, the correct decision, the decision a man makes with his head instead of his heart. He looked up. Amara was watching him now, arms crossed, her expression unreadable except for the fury simmering just beneath it. 5 years of fury, patient and controlled, like a debt finally coming due with interest. Amara, don't. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the ballroom's murmur like a blade through silk. You divorced me because you believed I was childless. You never asked why. And there it was, the sentence that would unravel everything. Because somewhere in this glittering room, dressed in silk and smiling like nothing was wrong, was the person who had made sure he never asked. The person who had altered records, intercepted messages, and buried 4 heartbeats under a 5-year lie to protect one inheritance: family. It's always family, isn't it? The people who pour your tea with one hand and quietly dismantle your entire life with the other. If you've ever had someone close to you smile in your face while working against you behind your back, hit subscribe right now, because the only people who won't are the manipulators, the secret keepers, and anyone still defending Taehyun's aunt by the time this story's done. Amara took the children's hands. We're leaving. Taehyun stood there, empire, fortune, and reputation all rendered completely useless, and understood, for the first time in 5 years, that some debts don't get paid in money. They get paid in truth. Taehyun did not remember deciding to follow her. One moment he was crouched on marble in front of a 4-year-old who shared his mother's eyes, and the next he was pushing through the Hyatt's revolving doors into the kind of soul night that made grown men reconsider their choices. Cold, sharp, unforgiving, much like the woman currently power-walking across the valet lane with 4 children and 0 patience for his existence. Amara. He caught up to her by a black SUV that was decidedly not his, decidedly nicer than expected for a woman who'd supposedly vanished into obscurity, and decidedly locked, based on the way she was jabbing at her key fob like it had personally wronged her. "Get in the car, Kai," she said calmly to her son, not even glancing at Taehyun. "Noah, hold your sister's hand. Arya, stop staring at him, it's rude." "But he's staring at me too," Arya pointed out, with the flawless logic of a 4-year-old who had clearly inherited her father's talent for winning arguments through sheer stubbornness. "He's allowed to be rude. He's an adult. Adults make bad choices." Amara finally got the door open and began the delicate operation of loading 4 children into car seats with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had done this alone roughly 1,000 times. Taehyun stood there in a $5,000 suit, watching his ex-wife wrangle car seats, feeling more useless than he had in any boardroom negotiation of his adult life. "Let me help." "You've helped enough." She clicked the last buckle into place and straightened, finally looking at him directly. Up close, the 5 years showed, not in wrinkles or exhaustion, but in something steadier, harder, like metal that had been through a forge. "You had 5 years to ask a question, Taehyun. One question. Amara, why did you leave without a word? You never asked it. You just accepted the story that was easiest for you to believe." "I believed what the doctors told me." "You believed what your family told you the doctors told you." Her laugh had no humor in it. "Funny how those aren't the same thing." The words landed like a corporate audit, finding a discrepancy nobody wanted to explain. Taehyun's mind, trained for 34 years to move fast, to see angles, to close deals before competitors finished their coffee, suddenly felt embarrassingly slow. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying ask better questions." She moved toward the driver's door. "Starting with your aunt." "My aunt?" "The one who visited my doctor's office the week before my final test results came back. The one who helpfully offered to deliver my paperwork to you directly, so you wouldn't have to be burdened during a difficult quarter." Amara's voice stayed level, but her hands, gripping the doorframe, were not. "I didn't understand it then either. I was too busy grieving a marriage and packing a suitcase to connect dots that seem painfully obvious in hindsight." Somewhere behind them, gala guests were spilling out for cigarettes and gossip, several of them very poorly disguising the fact that they were filming this entire conversation on their phones. Taehyun would deal with that later. Right now there was only Amara, 4 small faces pressed against tinted windows, and a version of the last 5 years rearranging itself violently in his head. "The infertility diagnosis," he said slowly. "You're telling me it was fake, manufactured. A lie so complete that even my own doctor's signature got copied onto documents I never signed." She got into the driver's seat, then paused, door still open, looking at him one last time with an expression that was somehow both exhausted and unbearably patient. The look of a woman who had rehearsed this moment in her head 1,000 times and found, now that it had finally arrived, that it gave her no satisfaction at all. Someone in your family decided 4 heartbeats were inconvenient to an inheritance plan. I've spent 5 years protecting my children from people who see them as a threat instead of family. So forgive me if I don't hand them back to you over champagne and hors d'oeuvres. Amara, please. If you actually want the truth, Taehyun, go find it yourself. You're apparently very good at running an empire. Try running an investigation. She closed the door. The engine started. And just like that, 5 years of buried grief and 4 children he'd never met pulled away from the curb, taillights disappearing into Seoul traffic while he stood frozen on the sidewalk like a man who'd just watched his own company get acquired out from under him. Ji-ho appeared at his shoulder, out of breath, phone still buzzing with what was undoubtedly 40 different family members demanding explanations. Sir, your aunt is asking why you left the gala so abruptly. Taehyun watched the empty street a moment longer. Something cold and precise was settling into his chest. Not grief this time, but its far more productive cousin, resolve. Tell my aunt, he said quietly, that I'll be visiting her office tomorrow morning. Tell her to clear her calendar. Ji-ho blinked. Should I ask why? No. Taehyun turned back toward the hotel, already pulling out his phone to call someone far more useful than a party planner, his head of corporate security. Just tell her I finally have a question I should have asked 5 years ago. Kang Corporate Security occupied the entire 41st floor of the Kang Holdings Tower, a floor most employees didn't know existed, and the few who did referred to only in whispers, the way medieval villagers might have referred to a dragon's cave. At 7 the next morning, Taehyun sat across from Director Han, a compact, unreadable man who had once made a hostile takeover attempt disappear so thoroughly that the attempting company's CEO still believed to this day that he'd simply changed his mind. I need everything, Taehyun said. Medical records from 5 years ago, fertility clinic communications. Anyone who accessed my ex-wife's files without authorization. And I need to know who visited her doctor's office the week before the divorce. Han didn't blink, didn't write anything down, just studied Taehyun the way a surgeon studies an X-ray before deciding where to cut. This concerns the children from last night's gala. Of course he already knew. By now, probably, so did most of Seoul. The footage of a Kang heir crouched on a ballroom floor in front of 4 small strangers with his face had likely made it into every gossip channel between here and Busan before Taehyun had even finished his first coffee. It concerns the truth, Taehyun said. Whatever that turns out to be. Han was quiet for a moment. Then, in the flat, careful tone of a man choosing his words the way one chooses which wire to cut on a bomb, he said, There's something you should know before I start pulling files, sir. 6 years ago, before the divorce, I flagged an unusual data access pattern on your wife's medical portal. Multiple logins from an internal Kang Holdings IP address, at hours your wife herself was not awake. Taehyun's stomach dropped somewhere near the 41st floor's foundation. You flagged it. To whom? To your aunt's office. Standard protocol at the time. She oversaw family compliance matters. Han's expression didn't change, but something in his voice did, some faint professional apology buried under years of institutional obedience. I was told it had been resolved internally. I didn't push further. I should have. There it was. Not a smoking gun exactly, but a fingerprint on the trigger. Taehyun sat back, feeling something in his chest tighten and click into place with the terrible clarity of a puzzle piece you'd been avoiding because you already suspected what picture it would complete. Pull it anyway, he said. Everything. I don't care whose name is on it. By noon, the picture had sharpened considerably. Forged signatures on medical release forms. A clerical assistant at the fertility clinic who had, coincidentally, received a substantial payment into a personal account the same month Amara's diagnosis was finalized. An assistant who, it turned out, had left the clinic shortly after and now worked quite comfortably as a personal aide to Taehyun's aunt. Intercepted correspondence, meanwhile, told its own story. Messages between Amara and her doctor rerouted, delayed, or simply never delivered at all, replaced instead with fabricated results that read, to an untrained eye, exactly like the real thing. Which was, Taehyun reflected grimly, the entire point. There's one more thing, Han said, sliding a final folder across the table with the reluctance of a man delivering news he knew would hurt more than the rest combined. A trust document, drafted the same month as your wedding. It names a contingency heir to the Kang fortune should you and Amara Williams fail to produce biological children within the marriage. Tae-hyun opened the folder. The contingency heir's name sat there in clean, unbothered legal font, as though it hadn't just detonated quietly in the middle of his chest. His cousin, his aunt's son. The polite, forgettable young man who showed up at family dinners with expensive wine and an even more expensive smile, who had spent 5 years congratulating Tae-hyun on his wise decision to divorce, who had in fact been present at last night's gala, standing conveniently close to the champagne fountain when 4 small faces walked through the door and made his entire inheritance plan collapse in real time. She didn't do this to protect the family, Tae-hyun said quietly, mostly to himself. She did it to protect her own son's future. My children were never inconvenient to the Kang legacy. They were inconvenient to hers. Han said nothing, which was, from a man like Han, its own kind of confirmation. Tae-hyun closed the folder and stood, adrenaline replacing the numb shock of the last 12 hours with something far more useful. The particular, focused fury of a man who has just learned exactly who to hold accountable and exactly how much power he currently has to do it. "Get my car," he said. "I have a family compliance meeting to schedule, and Han," he paused at the door, jaw tight, "find out where Amara is staying. Discreetly. I don't want to frighten her again. I want to apologize properly. And I want to know my children's names before I ever try to be part of their lives." For the first time in 5 years, Kang Tae-hyun had a plan that had nothing to do with quarterly earnings, and everything to do with earning something money had never once been able to buy him. His aunt's office occupied the entire 38th floor, 1 floor below corporate security, which Tae-hyun had always assumed was coincidental until this morning when it started to feel more like architecture with opinions. Madam Kang Soo-jin, she'd insisted on the title since her divorce decades ago, the same way some people insist on being called doctor at dinner parties, sat behind a desk of pale marble, sipping tea with the serene composure of a woman who had spent 30 years perfecting the art of looking innocent while being anything but. "Tae-hyun," she smiled, warm as a heat lamp, about as genuine. "I heard about the gala. Quite the scene. 4 children, was it? I do hope this doesn't become a tabloid matter. The Kang name has a reputation to protect." He sat down across from her without being invited, which he never did, and watched something flicker behind her composed expression, small, quick, gone almost before it registered. "That's the word you were going to use. Protect the Kang name. It's funny, Aunt. That's exactly the phrase you used 5 years ago, right before you handed me a folder of falsified medical results and told me it was time to let Amara go for the good of the family." The teacup paused halfway to her lips. "I don't know what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything. I have documentation." He placed Han's folder on the marble desk with the quiet, deliberate finality of a man laying down a winning hand. Forged signatures, rerouted correspondence. A contingency trust naming your son as heir, drafted the same month as my wedding, a full year before anyone diagnosed my ex-wife with anything. Silence settled over the office, thick enough to cut, the kind of silence that in every negotiation Tae-hyun had ever conducted meant the other party was recalculating, fast, for a way out. "You've always been dramatic," his aunt said finally, setting down her tea with the studied calm of a woman refusing to let her hands shake. "I did what was necessary. Your grandmother's health was failing. The board needed certainty about succession. And that woman has a name. Amara," she said, like the word cost her something, "was never going to give this family what it needed. I simply removed the uncertainty before it could damage us further. I protected you from wasting your best years on a woman who couldn't fulfill her obligations." "She was pregnant, Aunt Soo-jin." His voice didn't rise. Kang men never shouted. They simply issued verdicts, and Tae-hyun had learned from the very best. "She was pregnant with quadruplets, and you made sure I never found out, because 4 grandchildren would have ended your son's claim to everything you'd spent decades arranging for him." For the first time since he'd walked in, Madame Kang's composure genuinely cracked. Not much, just a hairline fracture across 30 years of careful performance, but enough. "Jun Seo deserves this company as much as you do. More, considering how little attention you've paid to the family in recent years, burying yourself in acquisitions instead of duty." So this was never about the bloodline. Tae-hyun stood, feeling something settle in his chest that felt almost like relief. The specific, clean relief of finally understanding an equation that had haunted him for half a decade. It was about your bloodline. You didn't protect the Kang family. You robbed it. of an heir, of a daughter-in-law who deserved better, and of 5 years I will never get back with my own children. Here's a question worth sitting with, and one his aunt clearly never had to. How many families quietly sacrifice the people who love them most just to protect the ones who never earned it? If you believe blood should mean loyalty, not leverage, hit that subscribe button, because the only people uncomfortable with that idea are the Sujins of the world, the ones smiling over tea while they burn your life down behind closed doors. You'll ruin this family, his aunt said quietly, no longer bothering to disguise the threat underneath the words. The scandal alone, the scandal, Taehyun said, already turning toward the door, is that you thought I'd let this go for the sake of appearances. I built an empire on due diligence, aunt. I should have done mine 5 years sooner. He paused at the threshold, glancing back at the woman who had spent 3 decades rehearsing serenity like a second language. Family compliance will be reviewing your access privileges effective immediately, and you'll want a lawyer. A good one. You're going to need it. He left her sitting alone behind pale marble and cooling tea, and for the first time since the gala, Taehyun felt something close to lightness. Not victory, not yet, but the particular clarity of a man who finally knows exactly who the enemy was, exactly what they'd taken from him, and exactly what it would cost to get it back. Now there was only one debt left to settle, and unlike his aunt, this one deserved to be paid not in consequences, but in truth, humility, and however many years it took to earn back the trust of a woman who had every right never to give it to him again. Han found her within 6 hours, not through surveillance, which Taehyun had explicitly forbidden, but through the far less dramatic method of checking which international schools in Seoul had recently processed enrollment applications for 4 children with the same birth date. Amara, it turned out, hadn't fled the city after the gala. She'd booked a 2-week stay at a serviced apartment near the Han River, close enough to finish whatever business had brought her back to Seoul in the first place, far enough from the Kang estate to feel safe doing it. Taehyun stood outside her door for 4 full minutes before knocking, which was 3 minutes and 50 seconds longer than he'd ever hesitated before a single decision in his professional life. Somewhere in those minutes, Kang Holdings' most feared negotiator, the man who once closed a 12 billion won acquisition in under an hour without blinking, rehearsed and discarded 11 different opening lines, all of which sounded, in his head, like exactly the kind of hollow corporate apology his aunt would have approved of. When Amara opened the door, she looked at him for a long moment, unsurprised, like she'd been expecting this exact confrontation since the moment she pulled away from the curb outside the Hyatt. "You found me fast," she said. "I suppose your security team earns their salary. I told them not to follow you, just to find out if you were safe." He held up both hands, empty. No folder this time, no evidence, no leverage. "I'm not here as Kang Holdings. I'm here as—" He stopped, because the word he wanted didn't feel earned yet. "I'm here as someone who owes you 5 years of an apology and doesn't know where to start." Something in her expression shifted, not softened exactly, but unguarded itself by a fraction, enough that she stepped aside and let him in. The apartment was small, warm, thoroughly lived in a way none of Taehyun's properties ever managed to be despite armies of interior designers. Crayon drawings taped to the refrigerator, 4 pairs of tiny shoes lined up by the door in descending order of size, the specific chaos of a household built entirely around the people in it, rather than the impression it made on visitors. The children were asleep, Amara said, in the next room, worn out from a day that had apparently included both a playground and, unavoidably, a great deal of gossip about their sudden appearance on Korean entertainment news. "I spoke with my aunt this morning," Taehyun said, sitting carefully on the edge of a couch that felt somehow more honest than anything in his penthouse. "I have everything: the forged records, the intercepted messages, the trust naming her son as contingency heir, drafted before we were even diagnosed with anything." Amara's jaw tightened, but she didn't look surprised. She'd clearly already worked out the shape of it herself, given 5 years and considerable motivation. So it really was Jun Seo's inheritance the whole time. It really was. He rubbed a hand over his face, exhaustion from 36 hours without real sleep finally catching up to him. "I keep running the numbers, trying to figure out how I missed it. I had access to everything, the accounts, the medical portals, the family compliance reports, and I missed the one thing that actually mattered, because I trusted the wrong people to hand it to me instead of finding it myself." "You trusted your family," Amara said quietly. That's not usually a character flaw, Taehyun, until it is. I should have trusted you instead. She was quiet for a long moment, arms wrapped around herself, standing near the window with the city lights behind her the way she used to stand in their old apartment, back when the biggest crisis in his life was a slow quarter, not 4 children he'd never held. Do you know what the hardest part was? Not the diagnosis. Not even the divorce, honestly, because by the time you said those 11 words, some part of me already knew we were finished. The hardest part was being pregnant, alone, in a foreign country, terrified, and knowing that if I called you, I couldn't prove any of it. Your family had already made sure the story was airtight. I would have looked like a woman inventing a pregnancy out of spite. I would have believed you. The words came out rougher than he intended. Maybe. Amara turned to face him fully. But you didn't ask, Taehyun. Not once in 5 years did you reach out and ask if I was okay, if I needed anything, if there was more to the story than the folder someone handed you. You accepted the ending because it was easier than sitting in the uncertainty of maybe being wrong. He had no defense for that because it was true, and because a man who'd spent his career refusing to accept unverified information from anyone had somehow accepted the most important verdict of his life without a single independent question. I'm asking now, he said quietly. Whatever it takes, however long you need, I'm asking now. Amara studied him for a long moment. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something adjacent to it, the small, dangerous crack of a door left slightly ajar. Then start, she said, by meeting your children properly, not at a gala, not as a headline, as their father. The meeting happened 3 days later, in Amara's small apartment, over a kitchen table crowded with juice boxes and the specific chaos of 4 toddlers who had strong, competing opinions about everything from seating arrangements to the correct number of pancakes owed per person. Taehyun had rehearsed this the way he rehearsed board presentations, anticipated questions, prepared answers, a mental outline of exactly how the conversation should go. None of it survived contact with Kai, who took one look at him across the table and asked, with the devastating bluntness only a 4-year-old can manage, "Why do you have Mommy's sad face in all her old pictures?" I didn't know I did, Taehyun said honestly, because lying to this particular audience felt not only impossible, but somehow beneath him. You do, Arya confirmed, climbing into the chair beside him without being invited, the same fearlessness she'd shown at the gala, apparently a permanent feature rather than a one-time performance. Mommy has a box of pictures. You're smiling in some, then you're not smiling in any of them. What happened? Across the table, Amara caught his eye, something unreadable passing between them. Not quite an apology on her part, not quite permission, but close to both. I made a very big mistake, Taehyun said carefully, choosing words meant for 4-year-olds and finding, unexpectedly, that they were also the most honest words he'd spoken in years. I believed something that wasn't true, and it made me stop smiling for a long time, but I'm going to try very hard to fix it. Is that why we're quadruplets? Noah asked, stumbling gamely over the word like she'd only recently learned it and was testing its weight. Because you were sad? No, Amara said gently, reaching over to smooth her daughter's hair. You're quadruplets because that's just how you arrived, 4 at once. Very dramatic, all of you, from the very beginning. Like Daddy's company, Lena offered solemnly, which Mommy says is very dramatic and makes the news too much. Taehyun choked slightly on his coffee. Amara, for the first time since the gala, laughed. A real laugh, startled out of her, quickly smothered but unmistakably genuine, and something in Taehyun's chest loosened at the sound of it in a way that 5 years of quarterly earnings reports never had. Your daughter has excellent instincts, he said. She gets that from surviving 4 years of press coverage about her own father without ever meeting him, Amara said, though there was less edge in it now than there had been 3 days ago. Small victories, apparently. The afternoon unfolded in a way Taehyun hadn't expected. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just ordinary, painfully ordinary, the kind of ordinary he'd been robbed of for half a decade. He learned that Kai was obsessed with trains and could name every subway line in 3 different cities. That Noah refused to eat anything green on principle, but would eat an entire cucumber if you called it a long green apple instead. That Lena cried at cartoons with even mildly sad music and considered this a completely reasonable response to art. That Arya, inevitably, ran the household with the quiet, terrifying efficiency of someone who intended to run something considerably larger one day. "They're extraordinary," he said quietly, once the children had been wrangled into an afternoon nap with the kind of negotiated ceasefire that would have impressed even Han. "I missed 4 years of this." "You did." Amara didn't soften the truth, but she didn't weaponize it either. Just stated it, the way you'd state a fact about weather, unavoidable and already past. "The question now isn't what you missed, Taehyun. It's what you're going to do about the years still coming. I want to be here, not visits. Not scheduled arrangements around board meetings. I want them to know me the way they know you, as someone consistent, not someone who shows up when it's convenient. That's going to take more than wanting it." Amara crossed her arms, though not defensively this time, more like she was bracing herself to say something she'd clearly been holding back. "It's going to mean facing your family publicly, not just firing your aunt quietly and hoping the story dies. If you want to protect these children the way you say you do, you're going to have to make sure no one in that family ever has the power to erase them again. That means the truth. All of it. Publicly." Taehyun thought of the board, the shareholders, the meticulously curated Kang reputation he'd spent his career protecting. Then he thought of Arya's stubborn chin, Kai's train facts, Noah's cucumber negotiations, Lena crying at cartoon music, 4 small, extraordinary reasons that made the calculation embarrassingly easy. "Then let's make it public," he said, "starting with my aunt's resignation, and ending with whatever it takes to make sure my children never have to wonder again whether their father chose them." The press conference took place 2 weeks later in the same glass-walled boardroom where Taehyun had once ended his marriage with 11 cold words. This time, the room was full of cameras instead of board members, and instead of a verdict, Taehyun had prepared something considerably harder for him to deliver. The truth, in full, with no legal team softening the language into something more palatable. 5 years ago, he began, standing without notes for the first time in his professional life, I divorced my wife based on a fraudulent medical diagnosis, manufactured by a member of my own family to protect an inheritance scheme. I want to be precise about what happened, because for 5 years, the story the public knew was a lie I helped spread by never questioning it. The room predictably erupted, reporters shouting questions, phones raised, the particular chaos of a story too good for any outlet to sit on. Taehyun let it settle, then continued, laying out what Han's investigation had uncovered. The forged signatures, the intercepted correspondence, the contingency trust drafted before any diagnosis existed at all. He named his aunt directly. He named his cousin, who had, predictably, already fled the country for a previously scheduled business trip the moment the story broke internally. He did not spare himself either, describing plainly how easily he'd accepted a story that let him avoid the harder work of asking questions. "My children," he said, and his voice, for the first time in the entire conference, wavered slightly, "are 4 years old. They have spent their entire lives without a father because I chose convenience over curiosity. That's not a mistake I intend to keep making." Amara watched the footage later that evening from her apartment, the children finally asleep, a glass of wine untouched on the counter beside her. She hadn't attended the conference, hadn't wanted the cameras turned on her and the children before they were ready. But she'd watched every second of the live stream, arms crossed, jaw tight, cataloging every word for sincerity the way she'd learned to catalog everything about Taehyun since the day he'd handed her divorce papers instead of questions. By the time he showed up at her door an hour later, still in the same suit from the conference, tie loosened, looking more exhausted than she'd ever seen him, even accounting for the man who used to work 18-hour days like it was a personality trait, she'd already made her decision, though she made him wait a beat longer before saying so. "The board didn't fire you," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "They tried." A ghost of his old dry humor surfaced, the first genuine flicker of it she'd seen since the gala. "Turns out publicly admitting fault and firing the people responsible for corporate fraud is generally good for shareholder confidence, not bad. My aunt's resignation is effective immediately. Legal proceedings are already underway. Jun Seo's assets have been frozen pending investigation. And the company? Survives. Probably stronger, honestly, once people stop assuming Kang Holdings only survives through secrecy." He paused, studying her carefully, the exhaustion in his face giving way to something more vulnerable. "I didn't do it for the company, Amara. I did it because you were right. The only way to protect them was to make sure no one in my family ever had the power to erase them again. I meant every word. She was quiet for a long moment, and Taehyun braced himself, the way he'd learned to over these past 2 weeks for whatever verdict was coming. Instead, she reached over and picked up 2 mugs from the counter, sliding one toward him. "Tea," she said. "Not champagne. We're not there yet, but it's a start." He took it like it was the most valuable thing anyone had ever handed him, which, given the state of his portfolio, was saying something. "I'm not asking you to trust me completely," he said quietly. "I know that takes time I haven't earned yet. I'm asking for the chance to earn it. Slowly. However long it takes." "Good," Amara said, "because that's exactly the pace we're doing this at." A small, reluctant smile pulled at the corner of her mouth, the first real one he'd seen aimed at him in 5 years. "You have 4 children who are going to test you in ways your board meetings never did, Taehyun. Arya alone will probably run this company better than you by the time she's 12. "I'm counting on it," he said, and meant it completely. Outside, Seoul's autumn had finally started softening into something warmer, the ice that had defined Kang Taehyun for 5 long years cracking a little further with every small, ordinary moment he was finally, deservedly, allowed to have. Somewhere down the hall, one of the children stirred and called out sleepily for water, and Taehyun was on his feet before Amara could even move, already halfway to the door. A father, finally showing up exactly when it mattered. If you believe truth always finds its way home, no matter how deeply someone tries to bury it, hit subscribe, drop a comment, and tell us which twist hit hardest. Some families protect their bloodline. This one nearly destroyed it. The difference, always, is what you choose to do once you finally know the truth.